Hey everybody, welcome once again. By way of introduction, my name is Melissa. I'm a first-year MBA student at Kellogg School of Management and part of the Decode team. Would love to give you a quick overview on what Decode is about. Decode is the largest tech and innovation forum, jointly hosted with UC Berkeley and Stanford student organizations, alumni networks, and entrepreneurship centers. The organization features speakers at the forefront of technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship from around the world. The mission of Decode is to give students, founders, and investors a platform to share, connect, and be inspired. Over the past 5 years, our annual Decode Innovation Conference have had over 10,000 audience every year. Some of our notable speakers include founder and CEO of Zoom, board member of Tesla and SpaceX, CEO of Y Combinator, and CEO of Google X. Our most recent conference last October had gathered 1.3 million views across 44 countries. And so since then, we've kicked off the speaker series, which has lasted for about 5 months now, in collaboration with not only Berkeley, Stanford, but also other top MBA programs like Haas, Kellogg, Booth, and MIT Sloan. Our next speaker will be next week, May 26th, so stay tuned for more details on that. On to the logistics for today's event. So after the fireside chat, there will be a Q&A session, and you can send in any questions that you have for our speaker via the Zoom chat. We'll try to go through as many questions as possible. And for those of you who are selected to join our roundtable session with Dr. Ramzan, you should have received an email from us confirming your spot. And we will be inviting you to join a separate breakout room directly from the Zoom meeting after the Q&A session ends. So please do stay around to receive that invitation. And also, another plug, we're also holding a networking session today in collaboration with Haas, Kellogg, Booth, and Sloan after this fireside chat. So if you're separately interested in that, just stay around and we can put you in that. And we will also be uploading the recording of this session on our YouTube channel, and we'll be sending the link to everyone. So definitely subscribe and follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and other social media handles. And also check out decode.build. It's a website for more content, and subscribe to discover our upcoming speakers. And if you would like to volunteer with Decode on future events or discuss potential partnerships with your school, feel free to send an email to careers@decode.build. So that's the information that I was wanting to share with you guys. And right now, Zulfikar and Shuo, our moderator, is in the backstage doing a separate interview. So we'll, wait a minute, a minute or so till they come back on, and I can give a quick intro on Dr. Zulfikar Ramzan. Just a few more seconds. I think they should be coming soon. We love awkward silences, don't we? Yes. Yes, we do. There we go. There they are. All right. Well.
Hello.
Hey, Shuo. So This is my intro. For tonight's session, we're pleased to welcome the Chief Digital Officer at RSA Security, Dr. Zulfikar Ramzan. As Chief Digital Officer, Zulfikar leads RSA IT, Security and Risk Office, Cloud Transformation Organization, Facilities, and RSA Labs, which is RSA's forward-leaning research and development organizations. In this capacity, Zulfikar drives the digital journey for RSA, including the implementation of IT systems and processes, refining their organization's data architecture and connected flexible workplace strategy, managing digital risk for the organization, and developing cutting edge functionality across RSA's product lines. He joined RSA in 2015 from Elastica, which was acquired by Blue Coat Systems, where he was a CTO. Before that, he was the chief scientist of SourceFire, which was acquired by Cisco. And then before that, he was chief scientist of malware analytics company Immunet, which was acquired by SourceFire. So lots of acquisitions going on here. He holds more than 50 patents and a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. His doctoral advisor was Professor Ronald L. Rivest, who is the co-founder of RSA Data Security. This session will be moderated by Shuo Chen, who is the general partner at IOVC, a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and a faculty member at Singularity University. So without further ado, let's welcome Shuo and Zulfikar.
Thank you very much, Melissa. A huge welcome to everyone. I think you're all in for a real treat. And Zuli, it's wonderful to have you here.
Let me unmute myself first. No, it's wonderful to be here. It's it's too bad I couldn't do this in person. I do like the Berkeley campus a lot. I love going to Cafe Strata, and it's been a few years since I've been there last. But hopefully, when the pandemic becomes more of a distant memory, I'd love to come back and hopefully in the future we can do these sessions in person.
Absolutely. We would love to welcome you in person when things go back to normal. I think that would be in the fall. Thank you so much for making time to be with us on Wednesday evening. So to start, maybe if we could start with a little bit more about your story of how you became Chief Digital Officer at RSA Security.
Yeah, so it's been a fun journey, probably not one that I would have predicted in any, just I think with most career journeys. I started off in academic research. I did my PhD at MIT. I was interested in my future was working at a Bell Labs or research type environment and writing papers and that sort of thing. And actually, one of the first jobs I had, I was at a small startup out of Boston. Right after I graduated, it was the middle of the .com boom, so everyone had to do a startup because that's what everyone was doing at the time. The .com boom sort of went burst. Actually, it had already burst before I started the job, but it was kind of bursting very fast. Right around that time, though, I was actually moving out to the Bay Area. My wife had a residency spot at Stanford, and she's still on faculty there as a physician. And I ended up joining another startup for a bit because I was just trying to get my feet slanted. And then I got a research position at NTT Docomo, which was the sort of major mobile wireless company, probably at one point the premier, especially out of Japan in the mobile market there. And they were kind of building a Bell Labs style environment in the Bay Area. And they had funding, which was unusual at that time in the early 2000s when everybody was reeling from the .com bubble bursting. They were doing really well. So they had a position for an academic researcher. I joined that program and had a phenomenal time there. Spent a lot of time collaborating actually with somebody named Craig Gentry, who was essentially my role was that they needed somebody who could collaborate with Craig because he was a math guy and I was a math guy. So we just hit it off right away. And that worked really well. And Craig's background is kind of interesting in that he was a mathematician and as an undergrad, decided to go to law school, and then realized after being a lawyer for 2 years that he didn't like law at all. And so kind of pivoted back into math at Docomo, and they hired him to help them with IP stuff. But he was such a talented researcher that he just sort of took off in that area. A few years into that, Craig was talking to me and I was like, hey, Craig, if you really want to be serious about academic research, you probably should get a PhD at some point because it's very hard to make your name out there. And so he's like, do you think that would work? And I said, yeah, I'm sure like any professor would be lucky to have you. I'll help you apply. And we talked to a good friend of ours at Stanford who was on faculty. I wrote the letter for Craig. He got into Stanford. And Then I realized I lost my favorite colleague to work with overnight. Craig's story is pretty interesting. And so at Stanford, he was given, his professor basically said, told the entire class, here's a major open problem in computer science. Anybody who solves it gets an instant PhD. 3 years later, Craig solved that problem. It was the homomorphic encryption problem. And a few years ago, Craig actually won the MacArthur Genius Grant for the work that he's done in that area. So I feel like just excited that I kind of helped him take that next step, which I think expanded a whole bunch of opportunities for him, and probably one of the best collaborations I've had over time. So I left Docomo to join Symantec. After all my colleagues had gone from Docomo, I didn't have anyone to work with. So I joined Symantec and got interested in the more practical sides of security. One thing I realized was that all the academic research in the world was not geared towards problems that people were really facing when it came to security issues. So it's easy as an academic to make up a problem and then solve it. And that's effectively what most people were doing and writing papers about the problems they made up. I was more interested in solving problems that people actually had in real life. So joined Symantec, was there for a number of years, worked on some pretty amazing things like building out machine learning systems for doing malware detection. This was like 2008, when people weren't even talking about machine learning in industry very much. And now the systems are used to detect probably, at any given time, we're used to analyze 1 billion plus files across the entire internet on a daily basis. And I think now every detection that happens from any Symantec product touches that code that actually I helped develop for being able to detect threats. And it was eye-opening for me because it was the first time to see that the work that I did with the telemetry, I could actually see it protect people. Like it was a remarkable experience. Actually, there's one particular case at Symantec where I was able to identify a vulnerability in popular routers like Linksys and D-Link. And so we fixed the vulnerability and we put some telemetry that told us whenever that vulnerability was triggered on systems. And 2 years later, there was actually an organized crime gang out of Mexico that was implementing the vulnerability and trying to exploit people's bank accounts using it. And we blocked it, but I could see that real-time data on every time we blocked that threat. Like I was saying, that was someone's bank account that just got protected, right? That was somebody's livelihood that we just helped. And that was an amazing experience. Like, someone who I don't even know, thousands of miles away, I was able to protect. And that got me hooked away from academia into the sort of industry realm. And since then, I was at a couple of startups that Elastica and Immunet, both of which went through a series of acquisitions. Got the chance to join RSA, and that was my dream job because my PhD advisor was the founder of RSA. So that was to me like where I've always wanted to be. And stayed at CTO for the first few years across all the product lines. About 6 months ago, some of you may have known this. We made an announcement that we were spinning RSA out from Dell, becoming an independent company. So as part of that new chapter, I was asked to oversee all of our initiatives to make RSA be a successful standalone company independent of Dell, which requires us to set up our own IT systems, our own security systems, everything from the ground up. It's like a 3,000 person startup. And that's where I took on the chief digital officer role. And that's where I've been for the last number of months. And the journey continues to get more exciting every day. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through my background.
That was amazing. And I think what's really incredible is that, Zuli, you have this amazing bridge between the academic and technology world, but also with the world of business and being able to tell amazing stories. So there's definitely some great stories that you have. I'll ask you more questions about in a bit. Sure. But if you don't mind sharing a little bit more about what being chief digital officer means for everyone. We have a ton of younger professional students, also more experienced folks, but that's a new role that didn't used to exist, a decade ago.
Yeah, I got to admit, I was kind of ambivalent about putting it on my LinkedIn profile because people won't even before I was a CTO, and at least no one really knows what a CTO does either, but at least people have heard the title CTO. I was like, chief digital officer, like my role is expanded, right? So people not realize that I'm doing more than I used to do in the past. But for me, what a chief digital officer has to do is help enable organizations to digitally transform themselves. So to be successful, as you all know, in this day and age, being able to embrace digital technology and use it correctly is critical. You can't be a successful organization unless you know how to embrace digital correctly. We had the opportunity as part of our leaving Dell to reinvent ourselves digitally. And now look, RSA as a company, our focus is on cybersecurity, helping our customers safeguard their most critical assets. But our customers themselves are going through digital transformation, and RSA's mission is to help protect them as they go through that transformation. But we can't credibly go to customers and say, hey, we're going to help you manage your risk during your transformation, unless we know what it's like to be going through that same transformation on our end. So for me, that's what Chief Digital Officer is really about. It's really ensuring that we are doing a good job of transforming the company and using the right technologies to solve the right problems for RSA and helping us move forward, but at the same time building that credibility to enable our customers later on to do the same thing.
Perfect. And to do some ground setting, because your work in the academic world is very much related to cybersecurity. So across your career, what will be some of the key milestones as well as upcoming trends in the world of cybersecurity that for folks who are not as experienced that they should know about?
Yeah, I think one of the big things, there's going to be several, big things I've noticed. So one, it's interesting to even look at cybersecurity over the last couple of decades, and I used to have something called the airplane test. That test does not date very well now that people don't fly anymore. But back when I was flying a lot, in the early days of flying, you sit on the airplane and somebody would sit next to you and they'd ask you what you do for a living. And I would typically say some version of information security, computer security, or cybersecurity. And that was the cue. That person was like, "Thank you very much," and they go back to doing their work, and I would get the next number of hours to do whatever I wanted. It was wonderful. And then I would say around maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago, when I started saying I do cybersecurity, the conversation became very different. All of a sudden, it was like, cybersecurity, and then the question would be, did the Russians do it? Or tell me about this latest hack. I just heard that this big organization got compromised, as my credit card say. And it was remarkable to see this issue that used to be considered more esoteric and of interest only to a small minority in the IT department suddenly became this front page mainstream news. I knew that moment arrived, by the way, when my mom asked me about some breach that she had heard about. And my mom does not have a phone, a cell phone, or a Facebook account, just to give you an idea of where she is on the technical spectrum of the world. I think she has a Gmail account after many attempts, and I finally had to make her one. But when my mom knew about like one of these breaches and was asking me questions about it, I was like, wow, I still don't think she knows what I do, which is a different story entirely. But to me, I think the big thing with cybersecurity now, though, is that the issues we see are so widespread, and there's a massive ripple effect that can occur when systems are interconnected. We saw this very recently. There was this amazing attack that was just talked about on the Colonial Pipeline, and it's an oil pipeline. It's causing effects all over the East Coast. People are striving to get gas, much like we were all trying to get toilet paper like 8 months ago. And now it's a gas shortage. And what's interesting about that is, a lot of people came out of the woodworks and talked about all the things that Colonial Pipeline did wrong. They're like, well, they should never have put that, their systems on the internet. I was like, well, look, they have customers. Their customers have to pay bills. They need a way to actually provide billing to a customer, and the only way to do that is to use this thing called the internet. So you can't talk about not being connected, and that's not the solution anymore. These systems are complex, and I think we have to move away from that model of assuming we're going to catch everything up front and really focus much more on how we detect and respond effectively, because there is a difference between those two pieces. And I think we're going to see this major nexus, this shift in the way that people think about cybersecurity away from prevention, more towards detection and response.
Amazing. I have to say, the moment when you've made it is when your parents actually start to understand what you're doing. So
yeah, they're not there yet. That might be a bit longer, but they at least know the field that I work in somewhat. And so to clarify that.
Awesome. I do want to follow up on that piece, because obviously you've made this unexpected change, it sounds like, from the world of academia to in the industry, and the companies that you've been executive positions in have been acquired and moved around. And curious to hear, what were some of the unexpected lessons that you learned along the way in terms of your career?
Yeah, I think one thing is, when you're doing a startup, you can never have a particular exit in mind. Number one, you have no idea where things are going to go. You're trying to solve an important problem, and that's what you're working towards. And that's what you got to be driven by. You can't be driven by, I want to make this much money, or I want to IPO. Like that should not be in your vocabulary. The driver should be, I think this is a really important problem to solve, and I'm going to work on solving it. Number one. Number two, I think the amount of open-mindedness you need to be successful. Like, you have to listen to your customers, listen to feedback, and pivot all the time. And then on the flip side, I'm going to say, and I'm going to contradict myself a little bit, you have to be also somewhat closed-minded. Like, if you believe in a certain vision and you think there's a compelling reason why that vision is right, sometimes you have to be willing to stick to your guns, even if other people are telling you it's not going to work. I mean, and look, by definition, entrepreneurship is that. I mean, you have to realize something about the world that other people don't quite realize. Because if they all realized that there would be no market, that would have been a problem that 37 other people would have looked at a long time ago. And I remember there was a, one of the companies I was at, we had a head of sales, one salesperson, and depending on the scenario, he would always show me, oh my God, like this competitor, did this, and or like, oh my God, this competitor released a white paper, and every day he was, depending on what a competitor's did, it would completely impact his mood for that day. And the one thing I realized in telling him, and I think it was such an important leadership lesson, is that like I can come up with an infinite list of things I'm not doing. It's very easy to think of all the things you're not doing. The real focus should be on deliberately picking the things you are doing that align to where you want to be. And so we knew that at that point, that we had certain goals in mind, and maybe raising more money was not going to help us get to our goal right away, or doing, a certain white paper was not going to get us there. We had to be deliberate and focused in where we wanted to be. And that was an important lesson. I think it's an important leadership lesson. Leadership is not about choosing what to do. It's also about choosing what not to do at any given time.
Absolutely. I want to also make sure to ask you a very specific question for different segments of our audience, given we have students and professionals. For students now, obviously the world of academia for cybersecurity is a little bit different. We still don't really have a specific focus area where you can go in and have this very well plotted out coursework in cybersecurity. So any recommendations for students that are looking to get deeper into this space, and how do they go about learning this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And at first I couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm on a few advisory boards for universities, and what I find is that the way they develop their cybersecurity curriculum is they look at their current faculty, and then they say, okay, what do they know how to do? And then they make that the curriculum for their cybersecurity program, versus saying, what do I need to train people in so they have good career prospects when they're out of this program, and reversing it that way. And I think that, to your point, there has just been this disconnect between what happens in the academic world of cybersecurity versus what happens in the real world. And oftentimes things that are, and I was, at some point I was always very frustrated. I'd be asked to referee papers all the time with my academic roots. And sometimes I get papers, like when I was at Symantec, I would get papers that were written on anti-malware. And, it was like these academics, and they're like, look, we came up with this wonderful approach. And I was like, okay, this was tried 10 years ago, didn't work. And nobody knows about it because it was done in industry. Nobody published the result. I mean, because that's not the focus. The focus of industry was to get something out the door. But also one other funny story, we had an intern at Symantec, so he looked at this problem we were working on. We were trying to build this machine learning system. He goes, oh, the work I'm doing for my academic research fits this problem perfectly. So we're like, great, why don't we, work in parallel? Why don't you try to build out this other approach while we continue on the approach we have now? Because we have to get this done by a certain time. So we kind of built these out in parallel. My approach was admittedly a bit more messy, not quite as elegant, but it worked better, had higher performance, higher efficacy, and so on. His approach was very elegant, didn't work as well, couldn't be put in practice, but it made for actually a very nice paper that he wrote and got published. And so it's kind of funny in academia, the goal is a bit different. It's more of a published goal versus can I make this work in practice kind of goal. And I think that to me has been another distinction. So if you want to learn more, by the way, I'll put in a bit of a self-plug. I felt this was an issue a number of years ago when I was at SourceFire. I began to actually make YouTube videos, very much in the Chalk Talk style of YouTube videos on different topics that I thought were relevant in cybersecurity. There were things I was seeing on a daily basis. So if you type my name, Zulfikar Ramzan, and just type in Chalk Talks, you'll see a whole bunch of them on topics from firewalls to IDS to anti-malware. There's maybe a couple of hundred videos that are on YouTube, and I'm afraid to watch them now. I'm sure I'll cringe at how I sound, I learned a lot about how to make those videos over time. So the earlier ones are definitely more rough around the edges, but that's maybe one starting point is there. I think another starting point is going to some of the big companies in the space, looking at some of the blog posts that they're writing, and getting a feel for what's going on, and then conferences. In fact, right now the RSA conference is literally happening this week. Luckily, it's all virtual, so that's why I can do this session. Normally this week I'd be in meetings back to back. But the RSA conference in general is probably the biggest conference in cybersecurity. There's a ton of talks available. If you go to the conference website or even the conference YouTube channel, there are great videos being posted every day by all the leading luminaries across the industry talking about what they're working on. And I think that's another way to approach things.
I think that's really great advice. And we'll be sure to look up the YouTube links so that we can share in email and follow up all the attendees afterwards.
Just share the bad ones. I mean, I think actually for some reason you might use at Berkeley. I did get a couple of emails from Berkeley faculty that, or I saw like on course websites that they were using it at that time to kind of flip the classroom. So, you could watch the YouTube videos ahead of time and then make the classroom session much more interactive. And I was very pleasantly surprised that had gotten there, because I never advertised it as such. I think I just put them online, and we just see what was happening.
That's great. And speaking of YouTube videos, we'll come back to that whole
Yeah.
other story in a bit. But RSA Security conference, obviously great for looking into for professionals as well, because I asked this question about students. So I want to make sure that we have a question for our professionals in the audience too. I know typically, especially if it's in pre-COVID days, it's been at Moscone, I think right before COVID lockdowns. And I remember going, and there's a ton of awesome cybersecurity kind of small dinners after the conference too, where people get together and talk about the latest trends. But other than that, any other specific recommendations for professionals who might want to learn more? Maybe it's not their role to do work directly related to cybersecurity, but that they're really interested in becoming more knowledgeable. Any recommendations for thinking about how to learn more, as well as how can that potentially be a leverage in their professional careers?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I think the one thing that I recommend, even if you're not interested in the field, like, or for its own sake, but want to look at it, in other realms, the National Association of Corporate Directors has published a bunch of guidelines and literature on cybersecurity, the kind of things you would need to know if you are a corporate director. And so what we're finding more and more is boards have taken cybersecurity as a much more prescient issue. And one trend in this vein, I think I remember this was a few years ago, there was a major attack. There was a ransomware attack that impacted a ton of organizations. It was based on a piece of ransomware called WannaCry, based on the Eternal Blue attack toolkit. And following that ransomware attack, some organizations were so massively impacted that they had to disclose it when they did their earnings announcements to Wall Street. And that was the first time I'd seen people talk about cyber attacks in their 10Ks and so on. That was an unusual concept. And so I think that kind of shed a lot of light for organizations that, hey, these issues, if you don't take them seriously, can pose a material threat to an organization. They are a material risk to consider. That's number one. Number two, with all the legislation around new compliance regimes like GDPR, which is the reason why now whenever you want to go to a website, they always tell you about the cookies on the website and they make you click a bunch of boxes. That's because of a compliance regime called GDPR, which is really called the General Data Protection Regulation. It's really about how you, it's really a way to force organizations to do a good job of protecting people's data. And it applies mainly to people in the EU, but there are other versions of legislation. Like in California, they've got CCPA, and in Brazil, they've got LGPD and others. But again, with those pieces of legislation, that's tying a monetary value to getting things wrong. Because if you mess up and you are afoul of GDPR, the fines are pretty astronomical. I think it was like, up to like several % of your annual revenue can be collected as a fine. And there's also a kind of a lower bound of that as well. So there was actually a pretty substantial coverage on it. And so I think everyone realized if we don't get cybersecurity right at the board level, it can have a major impact on the business. So I would look at the NACD and some of their guidelines as well for more sort of generic information.
That's perfect. I have certainly noticed in the last 5 years or so, there being much more of a push from a board level to say that there must be someone on the board who has knowledge or can bring in expertise around cybersecurity. So it's becoming really at the forefront of focus. And for folks who are, say, product managers or engineers who work in different divisions, is there anything that they could do to leverage their knowledge on cybersecurity related topics in their respective roles, or potentially get involved, whether there's kind of groups or associations that you're aware of that they can perhaps engage in earlier?
Yeah, in fact, it's a really good question. I think in terms of like an engineer, I think just basically, and as somebody more technical, learning how to build secure code is always a good thing. I think being able to deploy systems that are going to be resilient against the latest types of issues that are out there. A lot of people don't think of security at the onset, and then trying to build it in afterwards is very difficult. And more so, it often happens when the systems get really widely deployed. Zoom's a great example, actually. If you look at Zoom, early on, a lot of focus on convenience. There were some security issues that if you were a user of Zoom, you were aware of. If you knew something about Zoom, like I was aware of them. But as Zoom became more popular, those issues kind of really came to light at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think to Zoom's credit, they did a phenomenal job of responding and putting the right level of investment. But it definitely, caused a lot of issues at a time where they probably didn't need. They had bigger fish to fry. They had to figure out how to scale a really crazy infrastructure to hundreds of millions of people overnight, and they did an amazing. I mean, that's a story on its own. The fact that they did that successfully, but I think in many ways they saw that firsthand how critical it is to get some of the security pieces right at the onset. So I would say that, that on the technical lens, I think on the product management lens, I think that for many types of products today, especially ones that handle consumer data or that handle important information, security and privacy can be good selling points. For that, I think people now are much more attuned to all the risks to their data, more so than they have been in the past. Now, by the way, this is something that we've talked about for many years, and it's not clear to me yet if you can make it a selling point. I think we are approaching that realm where you can actually make it a differentiator. And so thinking about security issues as a differentiator for a particular product, like if you talk about how you handle data safely and the things you do around that, can make all the difference in the world. By the way, a great example like WhatsApp to Signal, right? I mean, WhatsApp talked about their privacy policies. All of a sudden, Signal got a ton of people on it. Unfortunately, Signal was not really designed with usability in mind, the same way that WhatsApp was. And so a lot of people joined Signal and then summarily didn't do anything on it other than kind of initially start. But it definitely caused, again, some upheaval for WhatsApp as well in that process. So being aware of people's mindset around privacy and that becoming a more forefront issue is something that I would highly recommend people to look into.
Absolutely. I think that's great. In fact, I can certainly back you up on more and more, not just enterprises, but also startups and individuals caring about that security piece. Actually, at the last RSA conference before lockdowns, I remember one of our portfolio companies, Pulse Q&A, it's the largest CIO CTO community online, where they got a bunch of different companies completely from different industries together, where they all said, this is just super top of mind. So really also a lot of credit to RSA for pulling together such awesome people at one place. And so now that we've really talked about your recommendations for specific things to do, I really have to ask you about overall forecast for the industry as well. What excites you about the future of cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think what excites me is that there's, it's always changing and you can never predict. I mean, so as people engage in digital transformation, and we kind of started talking about digital transformation at the beginning, what that often means is there are new buzzwords that are coming into the IT lexicon at a staggering, maybe even unsettling pace, right? 5 years ago, those words were things like mobile and cloud, then it became IoT, and then it became containers and Kubernetes and Docker, and every day we're in blockchain, et cetera. These are new things that are coming up all the time. And from a cybersecurity realm, what we have to think about is when these new initiatives get introduced, how do we manage risk around them? Because the rules may change to some degree in how we manage risk. So I think that's number one, the fact that there's just new technologies. Number two is the idea that we're seeing a level of hyperconnectedness that's unprecedented, where a small break in one part of a system can have a dramatic ripple effect in other parts of the system. So I talked about that at WannaCry ransomware, and everyone talks about the people who got directly impacted. What they don't talk about is the people who got impacted by the people who were directly impacted. Like, for example, let's say you are, a manufacturer, and you may have somebody who is relying on your goods and services, and they're waiting for a shipment that they're not getting because you haven't been able to deliver services to them. In fact, one of the people that was heavily impacted was a shipping organization. They were not able to ship properly for a while, right? Which means that the people who are relying on them could themselves not conduct business. So the economic impact is fairly significant across the board. And I think that's also kind of another key tenet that makes it's both exciting and daunting. But if I had to kind of shed a bit of positive light, and this is something I talked about earlier, the importance of detection and response versus prevention. To me, I think what's happened is we have to think of this realm in much the same way you would think of like a bank, right? If you were trying to protect a bank, you could build strong front doors for the bank. You could put armor on the front doors. But at some point, you got to open the doors for business. And a bank robber can just walk into the bank, right? Any given time. You can't prevent a bank robber from getting into the bank. But the bank robber's goal is not to walk in the front door of the bank. The bank robber's goal is to get the money that's in the vault and make their way out. In the same way, when it comes to cybersecurity, we can't prevent people from intruding and getting into systems that we build. But we can find ways to detect them and respond to them before they get to the most critical assets, the critical data, the critical compute cycles that those systems represent. And there's a window of opportunity between when they first get in to when the crown jewels are achieved that we can take advantage of. And that's something I would tell every business. You know your assets better than the attacker does. You know what's actually important. You know your business better. You should be able to prioritize better than they can in what they do, and let that be your advantage and never lose sight of that advantage as you think about protecting your infrastructure.
I think that's great advice in terms of just thinking about priorities instead of being overwhelmed with everything at once. And also looking ahead to the next year, given everything that's happened with COVID in the last year. How are you thinking about the future of work? Is RSA going back to in person? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, so as the owner of the facilities part of RSA now, something I think about all the time, I suspect we're going to go back to kind of a hybrid mode. It'll be a bit of an and venture where some people are going to want to at least spend some time in the office, but also maybe a bit more time than they were in the past at home. I can see us maybe not having as many facilities in the future. Like if we have an area without a lot of critical mass in the first place, or maybe with barely enough critical mass, we may decide, hey, those areas we shouldn't have facilities. We may want to double down on areas where we have more critical mass and make the facilities nicer in some areas. But I think from a broader kind of lens, it's going to be a very careful needle to thread, because on the one hand, there's certain problems, there's certain times where it's actually good to be able to work remotely and you get a lot done, you can be productive. And then there's situations where you actually have to be in person, where sometimes that interaction makes all the difference, and you can't achieve that as well over Zoom. And so I think, for us, the big challenge is going to be recognizing those scenarios, providing flexibility, but being, keeping a careful eye on the experience, the productivity, how we think about our culture as well. I think one thing I did during COVID is recognize that I told all the people in my organization that, hey, this is not normal. We're going through different times. You're going to be at home and on video conference. If your kids show up or if you've got a pet, don't pretend like they don't exist. Like they are part of your family. They're part of your life. Like I want to meet them. I want to see them on camera. Let's not pretend like we're trying to make our work life and our home life these two separate areas. Let's fully embrace the fact that they actually are blurred. And I think that it made life a lot easier for all the people that I think worked in my organization. But I think it's an important lesson across the board. We have to force that world of kind of work-life harmony and recognize that people do have lives. And we've, for so many years, shunned that part of our existence. And we have to kind of stop that practice. And I think if we do, the world will be a better place in general.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that's such an important part of work-life balance and how especially the younger generation is thinking about the future of their work. And on that, I have to make sure to save enough time for all your wonderful stories, because Zuli, you just have the best stories to tell. I think in addition to having an amazing career, you've surrounded yourself with such great people. And right before this main stage started, Zuli was sharing an amazing story about Sal Khan, who had spoken at our main conference, as a lot of our attendees would know. But Zuli, if I can ask you to share that story here with the attendees as well.
It's with a lot of pride I get to share that story. But so Sal, a good friend of mine, I went to grad school. I was at MIT at the same time he was, and after we both graduated, when he moved to the Bay Area with his wife, I had just my wife and I just had our first son. He was a newborn. Time frame was October 2006, and so Sal and his wife were one of the first people to come visit us when we had our baby. And I think our son was 2 weeks old. And I remember I was sitting there, and Sal was sitting next to me. His wife was holding our son. Sal was like, "You can hold the kid." He was still nervous, or they were still very young, hadn't had kids yet, so they weren't used to doing that. He's gotten better at that. And at that time, he was talking to me about this cousin he was tutoring, Nadia, and he was trying to kind of develop lessons for her. And where he started was he would talk to her on the phone, and then he was trying to come up with a platform to create problems for her to solve. And so he started off by finding problems online. Then he eventually said, what if I wrote some software to create problems and then automatically grade them? And so he's kind of walking me through this platform he's trying to build. I was like, Sal, what about like the actual instruction part? How are you solving for like explaining the ideas? Like, I just talked to Nadia on the phone and we try to coordinate, but it's gotten kind of tricky because she's got her basketball schedule and I've got time zones. And, so it was actually becoming harder and harder to actually talk to Nadia on the phone, in which case she would not be able to then do the problems. And so I said, Sal, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I've been using YouTube to share video of my son with my parents. That time, YouTube was the easiest way to share video in 2006. You couldn't just email a video file readily. In fact, you still kind of can't, but in many ways, that was the approach people were taking to share video. I said, what if you, instead of trying to make the software, which sounds really great, what if you just made some videos and put them on YouTube explaining the content? And he said, no, Zuli, YouTube is for dogs on skateboards. Like you can't do academic content in YouTube. And it's funny because he went home and said, hey, maybe I should give this a shot. So he made the first video for Khan Academy on least common multiple. You can look up. It's November. He may have taken that video down since then because it's very old. So I think he's still learning, but I think you can still find it. November 2006, a couple of weeks after this whole thing happened, got posted on the, I guess, the Khan Academy YouTube channel because he created it at the time. That was the first video of now thousands, and it's taken off since then. And it's this amazing story to I still remember like the conversation with him. By the way, he's changed his joke now when he says it publicly. He mentions cats playing piano as opposed to dogs on skateboards because most people forgot that the skateboarding dog was like the first cool viral YouTube video. Now it's more the piano playing cats or the meme people talk about a lot. And so every now and then he'll mention me by name in a presentation. The thing when he spoke at Berkeley, he referred to me as Zuli, which is fine. Like I'm not interested in it. I love the fact that he's doing it. I never want to take credit for it because he did all the hard work from that point onward. I'm amazed that the work he's doing and the fact that I got to be a really small part of that at the early days, it's a phenomenal thing for the world, and I use it all the time myself.
I really appreciate you sharing that story because I think the more I think we continue to do these events in terms of a speaker series to share experiences with students and professionals, the more we're all realizing how interconnected the world is and how in very unintentional ways someone can make a massive impact on the work that someone else is doing, and one tiny thing will ripple effect into plenty of other meaningful things, which is amazing. Sal Khan also just received an award by the Computer History Museum as leveraging technology for good, and I think something along the lines of lifetime achievement. The president at Computer History Museum, Donald Lewin, was our last speaker. So he was with Microsoft for a very long time as an SVP there, working with Bill Gates. And then prior to that, he was a co-founder with Steve Jobs. So it's kind of interesting how in different ways, how all of these people's careers and lives are intertwined in very cool ways. So really appreciate you sharing that story. Yeah. I definitely want to ask you about the cryptographic and blockchain piece of your story as well. Please do share a little bit more about how you're involved in this space, because obviously blockchain had a lot of its roots in the crypto and security world.
Yeah, so I got interested. It's funny. So my PhD work at MIT was on cryptography. So that's how I got really early on. Actually, part of the story there was a few different factors, but one of which was I was interested in cryptography in general. I started getting interested in machine learning when I was an undergrad, or what we used to call learning theory at the time, which is kind of the theoretical part of machine learning. And I noticed that some of the there were some recent papers, and not recent, that was as an undergrad, they were recent, but they were talking about the idea of what you could not solve using machine learning. And it turns out if you look at cryptography and machine learning, they're kind of like the exact opposites of each other. So machine learning says, okay, I've got this black box. I can see data about what goes in and what goes out. And now my goal is to understand how the black box works. That's effectively what every machine learning algorithm more or less tries to do. And cryptography says, okay, I want to build a black box. So even if you get to see what goes in and what goes out, no matter how hard you try, you can't understand how that black box functions effectively. And so it turns out there's a sort of deep mathematical relationship between these two fields that's been explored in the academic literature. And I got into cryptography starting with that type of question. And so when I applied to MIT, they just gotten this huge grant from DARPA. And there's an expression like follow the money. I realized if I align myself with the crypto group at MIT, they would have funding would not be an issue because they got this major grant. I thought it was an exciting problem space. Ron Rivest was at MIT at the time, and I'd read his book and I wanted to kind of be a student of his. So I got interested in cryptography. And one of the first things that's funny that you talk about weird connections and things. I remember. So I showed up, right? Okay, brand new grad student. I was like, okay, well, now what do I do, right? I'm here, like, I got to figure out how to be productive. So I asked Ron, I said, hey, can you recommend, like, what I'm here, like, what should I do? Like, give me something to do. And he said, well, Zuli, we just had this big conference in our field called crypto, and that's when crypto used to mean cryptography, not cryptocurrency. And he goes, look, why don't you take the proceedings of the conference and look at one of the papers, read it, and then maybe explain it to our we have a weekly reading group and you can explain it to that group. And so I looked at this book and of papers, I have like no idea what any of them do. I can't understand a single one. I don't know what's important. So I was like, okay, Ron, can you recommend a few that I can take a look at? Like, just give me something to work with. He's like, well, how about this one? He mentions a paper on a topic called blind digital signatures. And it was like a ridiculously hard paper to read. I don't think I ever fully understood the paper because it involved like It was highly technical and involved a lot of other background material. And as I was trying to get through this paper, one of my colleagues, another grad student, saw what I was doing, asked me, "Oh, what are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I asked Ron for a paper, and this is the one he gave me." And she goes, "Oh, that's a good idea." And I said, "Yeah, go ask Ron. He'll give you a paper to read too." And so he gave her a paper, and the paper he gave her was on something called the group digital signature. And so I said, "Oh, tell me about your paper. Let me tell you about my paper." And I was like, "Oh, what if you did something that combined these two ideas, like you do a group blind signature?" And we kind of worked on it together, and we figured out how to make this work. And the main application for group blind signatures was electronic cash and how you would actually build a payment system with some decentralization. And that was, I mean, talk about like nobody was talking about these topics at that time, but that was kind of the application we had in mind for this construct. So we wrote this paper, it got published in this conference called Financial Cryptography, which is a completely horrible name today. That name did not age well, because I'm sure people who would see that conference name would think it's about kind of cryptocurrencies, but it was about using cryptography for financial applications beyond just the core ones. And so early on, I got really interested in payment systems, and that's how I got kind of in the space. And with the background in cryptography, when Bitcoin happened, I remember actually I was on the mailing list where Satoshi Nakamoto sent the first email about Bitcoin. It was to a small mailing list, a relatively small mailing list of cryptographers, and it was October 31st, 2008. It was Halloween Day, so I remember this. And I saw this email from this Satoshi Nakamoto, who I'd never heard of, and he said, "Oh, I've got this new payment system, and it does all these interesting things." And my first reaction was like, seriously, like who needs it? There's so many payment systems, why does this, who is this Satoshi person? Nobody ever heard of him, and these things are important in cryptography. It's like in medicine. Like if you went to your doctor and they said, "Well, I've never trained in medicine, I just, became a doctor last week," you would get out of Dodge pretty fast, right? And the same thing is true with cryptography. If somebody says, "Hey, I got no background in this area, here, why don't you use my system to protect you?" You would probably not listen to that viewpoint. Now, I'm convinced Satoshi was not, as a pseudonym for somebody else and probably a group of people, but it was really weird at the time to see some unknown person talk about a problem that had been really looked at carefully. I do wish that I invested in Bitcoin back then, obviously, but my son reminds me of that all the time. I think now Dogecoin is the more relevant cryptocurrency. If Elon Musk is to be believed, it's a meme, which is it's funny to see. But I do wonder, if I'd made the investment back then in that area, what would have happened?
Yeah, it's this world of interesting connections and unexpected turns in careers. And I think something that's really valuable about you now spending time to share with this group of students and professionals is, who knows what unexpected connections they'll build and the kind of products and services and companies that they'll get to be a part of later in their career. So really appreciate you doing that. In the interest of time, I know we have a small group discussion put together. So I think that's a wonderful note to end our main stage discussion on. Thank you so much again for sharing with us, Zuli. Really excited to bring you over to our roundtable to meet with a smaller group of attendees from us.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This is really fun. I can't wait to hopefully do this in person in the future.